All right, so to get started here, let's just review a little bit our basic plan for adding the concept of data ownership to our backend. Okay, so we already have the concept of ownership, like who owns what notes, who created what notes in our application. And in order to add the concept of sharing to our backend, we're basically going to use a similar approach, right? So for ownership on the backend, right, who owns what note, remember that each of our notes had this created by property, which contained the ID of the user who created that note, right? This determines which user this note is going to show up in the My Notes list for. Okay, and what we're going to do here in order to allow users to share notes on the back end, now that we've set up all of the basic components on the front end for this, is we're going to add a shared with property to all of our notes. And that property is simply going to be an array of the IDs of the users that this note has been shared with. All right, now a few things I want to mention here. The main thing is that storing the ID of the user that this thing is shared with is just one possible option. What we might want to do, in fact, instead, and we'll actually take a look at this in more detail when we get there, what we might want to do instead is actually store the emails that this note is shared with instead of the IDs. Now, there are some trade-offs here, of course. One benefit is that storing the email instead of storing the actual user ID is going to make it a lot easier on the sharing page for a given note to just display the emails that a given note is shared with, right? So, in other words, we'll just be able to load the basic information for that note, and we'll already have an array of all of the emails that that note is shared with. Now, on the other hand, if we were to store IDs, and again, I'm just kind of talking this out with you here because this is the kind of stuff that you'll need to think about in situations like this. If we do decide to just store the ID in our shared with property, we're going to have to actually populate this whenever the user wants to load, find out what emails that note is shared with. We're going to have to actually go through and for each of these IDs, find the corresponding email for the user with that ID and send that back. And that's definitely something we can do. Maybe we'll even take a look at what both ways look like and see, which way is best. But that's just something to keep in mind that that's going to make it a lot more difficult. Now, on the other hand, storing this ID thing in the shared with property of our notes is probably going to make the other side of things, right, where we want to find all of the notes that have been shared with a given user a little bit easier because we'll just be able to look at the user's ID and get all of the notes that have that ID in their shared with array to send back to the user. So there's some trade-offs here, and one possible compromise even is instead of storing just an array of single values in this shared with property, we could actually store objects that contain both the ID and the email, as well as whatever other information we might need. Now, this does add a little bit more complexity because we would have to make sure that those things are kept in sync, right? If a user were to update their email and we were storing this in an object like this, so ID, blah, 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 email, blah, 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 that just makes it that much more cumbersome to actually go in and find an object with that email in the shared with property, change that to the updated email, etc., right? Whereas if it was just an array of emails, it would be a little bit easier to just find the email in there, remove it, and replace it with the new one. Okay, so there are trade-offs no matter what we choose. So really, to start off with here, we're just going to pick one of these and roll with it until we run into problems, if we run into problems. But anyway, that's our basic plan. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're actually going to open up our notes provider and just take a look at some of the things that we're going to need to implement in here, since this will give us an idea of sort of what kind of functionality we need to implement on the back end first. So we see that we already have this share note and unshare note properties. And additionally, when we actually load the notes in the first place, we're going to need to add some functionality to that so that this note that we're loading has its sharing settings already baked in. All right. At some point, we're also going to need to add loading functionality to get all of the notes that have been shared with a given user, and that'll be a whole thing in itself. So that will actually require us probably to break some of the functionality out into its own shared notes provider or something like that. Now, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But just to get a basic idea of the things we're going to do here, right, just to create a little bit of a list, we're going to need to allow ourselves to get all of the users that a note is shared with, and that will probably just be done in this existing endpoint, that we load the user's notes from. So that's the first thing we're going to need to do. B, we're going to need to allow the owner of the note to share a note with an existing user's email. Okay. And C, we're going to need to allow the user to unshare that note with that user, right? So in other words, remove a user's email from the emails that a note is shared with. Oh, and one additional one that I mentioned as well is eventually we're going to need a way to load all of the notes that are shared with a given user so that we can, here, if I just open up the notes page, what we're going to want to do here is, in addition to having the notes that belong to a user, we're going to want to have the notes that have been shared with the user. And that'll make it possible to reuse this notes list that's currently just displaying a user's notes that they created. We're going to reuse that with different data and display the notes that have been shared with a user. So now that we have that basic list of functionality we're going to need to add, the next thing we're going to do here is go into our backend, open up our routes, and let's start off by adding a route for sharing notes with a given user. So we're going to call this share note route. And what this is going to do, it's going to look something like this. We're going to say export const share note route equals. The path for this is going to be something like /notes/note ID. And then we'll add a final suffix on here, which will be something like shared emails, right? Because basically what we're doing is we're adding a shared email to this note. Okay, so that's what our path is going to look like. It's just one of several different paths we could have chosen, but it seems to work for me, so let's just leave it there, I suppose. And the next thing we're going to specify here is the method, and that's going to be a post method because we're in essence, creating a new shared email on that note. You could make this put as well. That, the case could be made for that, but we'll just make it post for now. And next up, we're going to have some middleware. Now for this one, we're going to use similar middleware to what we've used for all of our other notes. We're going to just take a look at the update note route, I suppose. And we're going to use the verify auth token and user owns note middleware that we created in our share note route as well. So we'll say verify auth token and user owns note. And those do have to be in that order because of how those things work behind the scenes. And here I just need to change the double quotes here to single quotes. And since I've got 4 of them, I'll just do a find and replace. There we go. And now we can specify the handler. So the handler, of course, is going to be async like most of our handlers are these days. And it's going to take the request and response as arguments, again, like every single handler we've seen so far. And the next thing that it's going to do, we've already verified the user's auth token with this middleware here. We've already made sure that the user owns the note, so we don't have to worry about either of those things. What we do have to worry about, though, is finding the user that corresponds to the email that the owner just entered, right? So in other words, what we're doing is we're adding an email here to shared emails. So the body of this post request is going to look something like this. It'll probably just have an email property, which will be the email that our user wants to share that note with, right? So john@gmail.com or something like that. So seeing as though we're just receiving the email, which the user has typed in, what we're going to want to do here is load the corresponding user with that email. Now, if we did just want to store emails that the user had shared this with, that would be a slightly different story potentially, right? Because we could basically just take this email and stick it directly into our shared with property on our notes, and we'd be good, right? However, what we're going to do here is we're still going to load the corresponding user for this email, primarily because we want to make sure that a user with that email actually exists. Okay, so at this point, we don't want to allow users to just share their notes with arbitrary emails. Those emails have to actually be legitimate users on our site already. Now, that might not be exactly what you want, and later on, what we're going to see how to do is actually check and see if there's a user with that email. And if not, we'll actually see how to send an email to their email address saying, hey, this person on NoteLab has shared this note with you. Join NoteLab to see it, something like that. Right? Everybody's gotten those kinds of emails from sites like Trello or Gmail or other sites that want you to join and create an account, essentially. So anyway, we're going to load the corresponding user for this email just to make sure that that email actually belongs to a user in our application. Okay, and then once we have that, once we've verified them, we're going to decide then whether we want to just use IDs or whether we just want to store their emails. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to have to start off by importing the users DB, right? That will allow us to make queries to the user DB to get a user with a given email, right? See if that user exists. So again, we verified that this request had a valid auth token. We verified that the user already owns the note and they're therefore permitted to do this. So the next thing we're going to do is get the email from the request body by saying const email equals request.body. And the next thing to do, of course, is to load the user with that email, see if they exist. So we're going to say const user with email equals, and then we'll say await users db.findOne. And we're going to say email. And basically what we're checking here is if a user exists with that email in our database. So now that we've gotten that, what we're going to do is just check to see if that user exists. So we'll say if user with email, or here, let's actually check if that user doesn't exist. And in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to say response.sendStatus, and we're going to send back a 404 status code. But additionally, we're going to send a message with this specifying that we're not returning a 404 because the note doesn't exist, but rather because a user with the email provided doesn't exist. So we're actually going to change this to response.status400, and then we're going to say .json, and for that we'll say message. And the message here is going to be something rather helpful. We'll say something like a user with that email does not exist. All right. Now, on the other hand, if a user with that email does exist, what we're going to want to do is add that email or the ID to our database. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say await notes DB, and we're going to need to import that as well. That was just imported for me up here. And the query we're going to make here is we're going to say update one, and we want to update the note with the note ID that we got up here. So and again, since we've already verified that the user here owns the note, we should be perfectly safe to ignore that logic inside the handler. So we're going to say const note ID equals request.params. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say await notesdb.update1. We're going to find the note with that ID. So we'll say ID, note ID. And the update that we're going to make is we're going to say $push. And we're going to basically push this user's email or ID. I guess we have to make a decision now. So let's just use the user's email, I suppose. We're going to say $push. We're going to push the user's email onto the shared with property. And what that looks like in MongoDB is we say shared with, and we're going to put the user's email into that. All right. And as a matter of fact, there's two extra things that I want to mention here. One is that we don't want to allow duplicate emails here, right? If a user tries to share a note with the same email twice, there's not really any purpose with that, and it's a little messy, so we want to block it. So the way that we actually do that in MongoDB is instead of using $push, we're going to use $add to set. Right? That might sound like kind of a confusing name, but basically a set is sort of like an array, except it's not ordered and it doesn't have duplicate, right? It's kind of a discrete mathematics term for those of you who haven't worked with sets before. But all you need to know is that that will add this email to the shared with property if the email isn't already on there. So what we're going to do here too is instead of using update1, we're going to change this to .findOne and update. And then we're going to say const result. Oops, not request, result, there we go, equals await notesdb.findOne and update. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say const updated note equals result.value. And now that we have the updated note, what we're going to do is we're going to send back the updated emails to the client. So all we need to do for that, and I guess we could just send back the entire updated note if we wanted to, but just to save bandwidth, let's just return the emails, the updated shared with emails for that note, because that's all the client side's going to need. And that will allow us to avoid doing the same kind of removing duplicates logic on the front end. Okay, so what we're going to do is say response.json, and we're going to send back the updated notes shared with property. All right, so that's our share note route. Let's open this up, and we're going to export it from our index.js file. We'll just add it to its own new section here, I suppose, in routes. We'll say share note route. And here, let's just do that up here as well. There we go. Okay, so we have share note route added to our routes. Let's just run our application to make sure that everything is working there so far, that we don't have any syntax errors. So we're going to say npm run dev. And that should load our app, and everything should work just as before, right? We shouldn't see any errors on our back end. That's really all we're doing this to make sure of. We should see servers listening on port 8080. Okay, so that's how we create the shared note route on our back end. And we've also taken a look at a lot of things to keep in mind when implementing this kind of functionality. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.